Hi everyone, my name is Carla Heath and I'm going to talk you through running a creative agency, how I got there and the various stages in my career, and also what it's like day to day and how it feels running a creative agency. I'm going to start with going back to my A levels. I studied English, classics, and art. And I guess going back then, it felt like I had four main options. And those were university. So that was either to study fine art or to do a non practical degree, to go out into the workplace and earn a living, and possibly an apprenticeship, to go to art college or to travel. Now, most of my friends at the time were going to university, and like I say, I don't think there were a huge amount of options, or certainly not what the options are now. But I had a good think about it, and art college didn't feel like a direction I wanted to go in. And I guess in hindsight, I have to admit I was probably a bit nervous about my skill set and worried that everybody would be better than me. So I basically ended up opting for a non-practical degree. So off I went to Leeds University to study history of art. Pretty much excited about going up. I was based down south, and going up north was to a big city was super exciting. And off I went. The degree itself ended up being absolutely brilliant, very interesting. Learned loads, not just about art, but I guess also culture, history, and society. And my modules covered a huge range of subject matter. I learnt how to form an argument, both in the form of long essays, but also verbally, which was, looking back, an incredibly important skill, especially in what I do now. But most importantly, I only had 6 scheduled hours a week, which when you're a uni student is absolutely brilliant because it gives you more time in the bar. And yes, I studied hard, but I also played hard as well. And also, we had a trip to Paris. One of my modules was on Rodin. So we got to go to Paris for a long weekend, which was brilliantly good fun. Back in the days before Eurostar, we flew over, all the guys on my course. So highly recommend a history of art degree. Having said that, once I got my BA Hons, I realised that really, in terms of that degree, nothing vocationally was really kind of immediate. I could go into curation or restoration of artwork, and it didn't really feel like something I wanted to do. So it sort of flagged up, well, what do I do next? And I ended up doing a whole range of jobs, basically just to pay the rent. I worked as a customer services assistant at IKEA, which basically meant I dealt with frustrated customers, both on the phone and face to face. I worked the night shift at Royal Mail. I was a buyer for what was then the Burton Group, they're now the Arcadia Group, so the top shops, Dorothy Perkins of this world. And I did various project management roles, I guess. Excuse me. I guess all of them, whilst they were literally just to pay the rent, were quite administrative based and quite commercially based, which, looking back, whilst it didn't feel necessarily like I had a real direction, I learnt so many valuable skills, whether it's people skills or project management skills, and kind of helped me on my way. But having done that for sort of 4 or 5 years, I had a realization that I really, really missed being creative, and there was something missing. And I started doing a bit of design in my spare time, but it felt like I was missing, from a vocational point of view, a creative direction. So I started studying in the evenings, a little bit of design theory, but mostly software, because the idea of not having that background and not understanding how to put together a piece of creative was incredibly intimidating. So I did evening courses for sort of 3 to 6 months. And I also got my first creative job as a designer, which was a very, very strange old-fashioned place in Bristol, a chartered surveyor, and so old-fashioned they even had a tea lady who came around with a tea trolley, but just on a Tuesday. But yeah, it was my first creative job designing their marketing presentations and leaflets. So not hugely creative, but gave me a very good grounding in the basics of graphic design. And from then, I guess I spent the next few years working across various design roles. So all of them in-house, or the other way of describing that is client side, which means you're based within a brand. So for example, I worked as a marketing designer at French Connection. So I was designing all their website content, all their in-store communication, brand communication, and all very much focused on their brand. I was also a product designer for a stationery company. I designed greeting cards, so I worked for Hallmark Cards for a while and did a couple of brand design roles for various other clients. And as I say, all of those were in-house and client side. And then in 2008, I made the big move over to agency world, which felt like a huge challenge at the time. It's a completely different way of working. It turns out when you work for an agency, you get charged by the hour out to clients, which I didn't really realize. The work was definitely more varied and definitely much more of a fast pace. But I mean, there's positives and minuses in both. You get less ownership of the brand when you're working in an agency. So you may do the front end of a project and arguably the more shiny, exciting end of the creative project, but you don't always get to see it through and find out what's worked, what's been successful, and develop the work. So it was a whole new experience and quite a challenge at the time, but turns out it was probably, again, a really good move that I made. So that was back in 2008. And then I started to move more into a sort of hybrid role. We were a super small agency. We were about 8 people. And so I started doing what is known now as client services as well. So I was responsible for a couple of the key clients. Give you an example, I'd go up to Tesco, take a brief from Tesco, come back. Because I was creative, I'd then design the work, run the project through, go back up to them, present, and then invoice them. So it was quite a general role. But of course, brilliantly, it gave me a really rounded experience. So I had both the creative side and the client services side. It wasn't something that I necessarily planned, but it was just the way it evolved organically. But great background in terms of having both sides. And then in 2010 was what I describe as the sliding doors moment. As an agency, we'd started doing a lot more work over in Australia. We had a big supermarket client in Australia. And my boss at the time had talked about going over there to set up a studio. So he turned around one day and said, I need to move over to Australia and set up the studio. And so he asked me if I would run the business, which basically made my head explode. And I sat there and panicked for, I don't know, 24 hours, went home, had to think about it. And, you know, it's not something you get offered to do every day. And I mean, my biggest consideration or biggest concern was the financials. It was that idea of being stood in front of the dragons on Dragon's Den and them pulling you up and saying, well, what's your gross margin versus your net margin? And of course, like with everything, you don't think about necessarily, oh, don't worry, I'll learn it. But it's more a case of not knowing what you don't know. So it was a big decision. But I said yes. You've got to take opportunities when they come along, I think. It was a steep learning curve. I had to learn quite quickly the financials, how to read accounts, not necessarily how to become an accountant, but certainly how to understand the commercial side of a business. So what's basically going in and what's coming out. The various exciting points around tax returns, lots of legal, contractual bits and bobs. And I mean, with all of this, you always have external input as well. So there would be a lawyer, there was an accountant, but you need to understand the basics of this in order to run a business. And simple things like, how do you start to charge clients? How do you bill them? How do you charge per hour? What's it based on? And other things like how to pitch, how to present, how to develop client relationships. And like I say, a very steep learning curve. But I kind of worked out the best way to learn this stuff is just to do it, as with everything in life. Just jump in at the deep end and get on with it. And there's no right or wrong way. There's a right way for you at that right time, but there's no wrong way. And often what is right now for you might not be right in 10 years. But I think, again, it's about experimenting. And like I say, the thing I learned was, I guess there's no right or wrong way. And you work out the direction you're going by listening to lots of people, whether that's senior people, whether that's mentors, whether that's junior people, whether that's peers. Everyone's opinion is valid. You have to try lots of things. And again, this is relevant to anything in life. And you've got to make loads of mistakes. And I think that's really important. And then learn from them and work out what you did wrong and what you need to do differently moving forwards. And so I guess then what does it feel like? What does it look like to be at, I've called it the summit. I'm not necessarily sure I've peaked in my career as such, but this is the summit in terms of running an agency. What does it look like? Well, pretty much I would say on a daily basis, you've got new stuff being thrown at you, literally minute by minute. So it can be curveballs coming left of field, new challenges coming at you, but also new learnings, new goals as you try and establish where you're going, new problems, but also new successes. It's new, and you build up experience by having so many news, which is, if you're the right kind of person, is super exciting. And essentially, you're creative problem solving. So I'd move very much from a creative in terms of technical creative designing to creative problem solving, using all my experience I had gained in my various roles. And so I thought it'd be useful to describe to you an average day running an agency. And it basically looks like this. There's no such thing. You start with a plan at 9. Or earlier or later, whenever it is. 5 minutes later, a client calls and asks you to come up with a new brand or a new campaign because something's going to press in 5 minutes. So the plan completely changes. So at 9:10, 5 minutes later, there'll be a team challenge. Somebody's off sick or somebody's being pulled onto another job. So again, 5 minutes later, the plan changes again. So you start with a new plan, repeat. So you get the idea. That's a very simplistic way of thinking about it, but in agency world, everything changes, and you start the day with a list or a plan, and it gets turned on its head, and you just have to adapt. And the other thing is the work is cool. The work is really good fun, and whilst I was at Whippet, we've done a lot of projects which I'm super proud of, a lot of brand identity work. So Holland and Barrett on the left and M&S Food on the right, both two good examples of rebrands. The Holland and Barrett one is a before and after, just in case you were wondering. But that's very much a case of not just logo work, but developing a tone of voice. So how does the brand sound? What's the illustrative style? What's the photographic style? The colours, the fonts? How do the brands show up? And then we do a lot of campaigns, that's copy and design, and also a lot of the thinking. So working out how a brand's positioned relevantly in the marketplace in relation to other brands. And so the great thing about what I was working on was I get to see it out in the wild, as I'd call it, walk down a high street and see the work we'd completed, which is incredibly satisfying. So how does that all work? Well, when you run an agency, you work out pretty much clients come from one of three places. You either pitch for them cold, or you've already got an existing relationship with them, or it's somebody that's been recommended, or you've been recommended to somebody. Sometimes it's a combination of all three. Each have their challenges and their pluses and minuses. Pitches in our industry are often free, which means they're not commercially that viable, but unfortunately it's the way it currently works. So you'd much rather go on an existing relationship or a recommendation. And then all projects pretty much follow the same route, although it's not quite as simple as this, but you will be briefed by a client, they will give you an idea of budget, you go away and create the work. And then obviously there's a lot of going backwards and forwards in terms of presentation and adaptation. But that's the sort of basics of how you work on a creative project. So what's the job of an MD as part of all of that? So I've very much moved from being hands-on, doing the actual creative, managing the projects, working with clients, to becoming a managing director. And I've always said that the role of an MD is to set the direction of the business. So the North Pole, set out the direction in terms of where the business is going, what the business looks like, represent the business, set out any strategies, develop the culture, and then facilitate the team to get on with it. And that means very much setting up everything they need to deliver the job. So your role is very much steering the team rather than being hands-on, although the ability to jump onto the tools and be hands-on is often quite useful. And by the time I left, we were about 30 people strong. So you become more and more strategic and less hands-on, but it's still useful to be able to do it. But your team are essentially building and maintaining those client relationships, delivering projects on time, ensuring they're financially viable, all work is on brief, and also just creatively amazing. And that's really important. And you're essentially guiding and putting them back on track when needed, but stepping back enough to allow them to get on with their jobs, which is often quite hard when you've been used to being hands-on. I've sort of likened this in the past to being a goalkeeper. You're sort of the one who is the last line of defence, but also having sort of, I guess, been the manager of the team and set out the formation. You're then there to catch any bits that fall or spin any plates that need to be spun. But at the end of the day, I guess the most important thing is it's really, really good fun. If you're up for it and you're up for those steep learning curves and the various challenges that come with it, it's a really, really fun world to be in. And running an agency is terrifying, a huge responsibility, but incredibly rewarding and super exciting and super fun. So that's the end of my career. That's all, folks. That's where I am up to date. Except it's not. There is no end. There is no summit. There is no ultimate success. I think we're all constantly learning. And I also think success is not about job title or how much you earn. It really isn't. Job titles mean different things in different businesses. They mean different things from an agency side to an in-house side. It really isn't down to that. It's about doing what you love. And that can't be 100% all of the time. But if you do what you love most of the time and you're with talented people that you respect, then that's success. That's ultimate success to me. And so when people describe or ask me, about my success in terms of running an agency, I could talk about how much I grew the team or the percentage of turnover or the profit we made, but it was absolutely about the work and the people I work with. And that for me is why I ran an agency and why it was amazingly good fun. And if you're up for it, I can't recommend it enough. So thank you for listening to me today. I hope that was interesting and hopefully helped you in some way understand a bit more about the industry and the role of managing director. Thank you.